What's up guys, welcome back to Pat Outdoors. Since we're still waiting for a couple parts to come in for the Razor SX500 project, I decided to pick up another bike for us to work on for the meantime. This is a 2023 Surron Light Bee X, which I picked up from Craigslist recently, and as you can see, it is pretty banged up. The seat is all torn up, the cover under it is all cracked, the rear fender is completely missing. The handlebar is all crooked on the fork. Even the headlight is pointing to the right. Top of the headlamp's all scratched up. The fender's all scratched up. The back of the fender is even missing completely. So it's definitely taken quite a beating and been looped a couple times. You can tell since both brake levers are all scraped up on the top side, and even the throttle's all loose. It doesn't work half the time. Grip's all torn up. So we definitely have quite a few things to address before we can safely get this thing back on the road. I've currently got the battery fully charged to 100, but this bike's currently have this issue where I turn it on and most of the time the throttle doesn't, throttle decided to work there, then it just randomly stops working. So we definitely have some things to fix before we can take this thing out for a ride. But overall, I think it's still a good starting point at a decent price. Since it has quite a few issues, I was able to get it just under $3,000, which I'm not hating on too much since it's a pretty new bike. It's a 2023 production, and it even comes with a Kanewaba pedal kit set, which is also not installed correctly. So let's get this thing on a stand and do a full-on bike check. Can't say I'm a big fan of the pedal set. I'm gonna show you one thing real quick. When you have the kickstand down, you cannot roll the bike back since it gets caught on the kickstand, and it's definitely scraped up against it quite a few times. So I really think that we're gonna be swapping this back out for a peg set. And man, the thing's also loose. In a way, I'm pretty happy that I feel like we're saving this from the previous owner. We're gonna bring it back to a good life. Okay, let's see if the throttle works again. Yeah, it's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, so I can't be stranded on the road with an inconsistent throttle like that. So we gotta figure out what's going on here. But first I'm gonna take off the seat because I cannot stand to look at this thing. I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of how Surron decided to mount this plastic cover on. Yeah, first you gotta pry out this small pin, then you gotta pry out the insert that it was in. So after you've taken the plastic cover off, you just have to take the 4 10mm nuts off. Well, that's good. At least the rear subframe didn't get bent. But I'm definitely going to be replacing this upholstery. So I'm going to start by taking these staples off. Once you've got all the staples out, you can simply just peel off the original cover. Oh, looks like I missed one staple. And that is it. We are ready to reupholster this thing. I'm just using a replacement seat cover that I picked up on eBay for like 25 bucks. And then I'm using a staple gun and some T50 staples. I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch one, the most shallow, so it doesn't pierce through the padding. If you're interested in any of the parts that we're using for this project, I'll have everything linked in the description below. Just a quick reminder, I'm not a professional. I'm just some random guy on YouTube sharing my projects with you guys. So please don't take this as a serious tutorial, but this is how the bottom of my seat ended up turning out. And here's the top. I think it turned out pretty clean for the most part. I'm really glad the subframe's not bent. That would have been pretty disappointing. So far, I think I'm like $120 into replacement parts. I bought a throttle, I bought some grips, replacement rear fender. I'm not gonna put the bottom cover on just yet. I wanna repair these cracks on the sides of it before I reinstall it. For now, let's go work on the fender. Looks like we're already missing one bolt here. So the thing about picking up other people's projects is you'll notice it's missing bolts here and there. Luckily, I have a lot of spare hardware from my Talaria. Look at that. That's what's left over. I'm gonna be replacing this broken front fender with one from my Talaria XXX. I barely used this one since I decided from the beginning that I'm not gonna run one on that bike, since I kind of like how it has a mountain bike-ish look to it. So this one's in very good condition, and it appears to have the same exact bolt pattern as far as how it mounts to the fork. So hopefully this fits perfectly. Bolt pattern seems to be just right. And here's how that looks. It almost seems like a factory option. Next thing I want to do is straighten out the handlebar. Just way too pulled to the left right now. Upon closer inspection, it looks like the fork is completely symmetrical. It appears we just need to make an adjustment to the stem. To do that, you just loosen these two Allen bolts on the sides of the stems. In some cases, if the top bolt was tightened too much, you may have to loosen that as well. But in this case, we just have to loosen the rear ones. All right, that appears to be perfectly center now. And just like that, the handlebar is straight. Also, what do you guys think of these Fast Ace 37 forks? Are they any better than the D&Ms or the KKEs that come on other Surrons? Dang, this guy only had one bolt on each side holding the axle in place. So I'm gonna be adding two more. This is why you don't just hop onto anybody's bike and just start riding. It's always good to do your own inspection just to make sure that you are riding safely. Might as well check the tire pressures while we're here. I typically like to run my back tire around 25 PSI. All right, well it's already at 27, which is right around where I wanted it to be. And then on the front tire, I typically like to run it around 30. And that's at 22 PSI. That seems kind of odd to have higher tire pressure in the back. I wonder what this guy was thinking. The next thing that I want to address is the chain tension. I think this has way too much slack in it. You definitely want it a little bit tighter than this because you could risk dropping the chain. 17 millimeter. Jesus Christ. Somebody must have really torqued that down with an impact. Next, you want to unlock the adjustment points on both sides of the swing arm, which is just this 10 millimeter nut. You can back it out on both sides. Then you can turn these adjustment bolts counterclockwise to bring the rear axle further back in the swing arm, which will then tighten the chain tension. Just make sure you do it in even increments on both sides to make sure that the rear wheel is tracking straight. There are also notches on the bottom of the swing arm to help guide you, give you an idea if both sides are adjusted evenly. Once you have the chain tensioned exactly where you want it, you can lock the adjustment bolts back in place. All right, next I'm gonna reposition the headlight. It is pointed way too high and the bracket's actually bent. First, let's straighten out this bracket. Top should be perfectly flat. Actually, you know what? I just noticed this thing is upside down. That makes a lot more sense. I ended up repairing the cracks on the seat cover by applying some adhesive on the inside portion, so you can't really tell from the outside. The next thing I want to address is this kind of wobbly pedal set. I notice that when I'm trying to pedal it hard, sometimes the shaft actually doesn't even move at all. So I know that the sprocket that's bolted onto the shaft is spinning in place sometimes. And I also notice that the brackets themselves are just very loose. So I'm just going to do a full bolt check on the whole kit. Wow, this pedal is like completely loose. You know what? It's not just loose, it's actually bent. Yeah, if you look at it this way, it is not a 90-degree angle. This pedal is actually bent forward. So I'm just gonna see how I like the pedal kit. That's not gonna keep it from working. And then this is the sprocket that I was talking about. When I'm pedaling hard, I notice that the sprocket just spins in place. So you can see it's a two-piece sprocket. So I think I just gotta torque down some of these bolts and hopefully that'll keep it from slipping. You know what? I might have an easier time reaching these 3 bolts from the bottom. All right, now it's working how it's supposed to. Next, I'm gonna be removing the skid plate so that we can access and disconnect the tip sensor or crash sensor as some people call it. Since I am planning on taking this Surron on some off-road trails, I don't want it to randomly shut off on some big bumps. And we also gotta disconnect the throttle cable from the controller since we're gonna be swapping this out in just a moment. But before we do any sort of work with the electronics, we wanna make sure that we disconnect the breaker. So we're just gonna turn this off. That's gonna cut power to the bike. This just prevents you from shorting anything when you're messing with the electronics. As you can see here, the green wire's already been cut. So this Surron's already been de-restricted as far as the speed limiter. All right, as you can see here, the previous owner already just cut the wires for the kickstand. I believe this 3-pin connector down here is for the throttle. Disconnect that. You know what, I'm actually gonna take this plastic cover off and I might even unbolt the controller. Just swing that out of the way so we can properly tuck the wiring for the new throttle. And I believe the tip sensor is actually up here above the controller. All right, I'm just gonna carefully hang the controller So here's what the tip sensor looks like. That's what I'm trying to disconnect, is this wiring right here. So I'm gonna have to follow that wire up to its plug and disconnect that. I'm thinking I might be able to unbolt the sensor since we got no plans of running this anyway. I just gotta get it from the hardware on the inside of the frame, which requires me to remove the battery real quick. With the battery pulled out, we can now access those two bolts. So I'm gonna remove those and pull the sensor out from the bottom and disconnect the plug. That's what the plug looks like. Gonna pull it out, and that's what the tip sensor looks like. I have to reinstall this bracket since this is the upper bracket for the controller. So I'm just gonna remove this tip sensor out of the way. So I'm gonna leave this out. I'm gonna slide the battery back in. Plug the power cable and the connector for the controller. Next, we're gonna swap out this busted throttle with just a standard replacement one I got off eBay. Hopefully this works. What is up with all the helicopters outside? Make sure this spins freely so your throttle doesn't get jammed or get sticky. Very important thing to remember when installing a throttle is make sure that this flat spot meets up with the brake lever. That flat spot's actually meant for additional clearance for the back side of the brakes so that it doesn't bind up against the throttle when you're pressing it. Let it cycle, and we are still having throttle issues. Dang. I plugged up the throttle to make sure that it works before we put everything else back together, but looks like we're still having some throttle issues here. I'm gonna do some diagnosing. So at this point, we've already removed the tip sensor, replaced the throttle, and I even disconnected both brake sensors. And I even took out the remaining part of the harness for the kickstand since maybe it was shorting out. Dang, this is pretty unfortunate since these are the 4 most common issues that keep a Surron from turning on and throttling. So let me know if you guys have any suggestions for further diagnosis on this. I'm really hoping I don't have to replace a controller. So for diagnostic purposes, I opened up the factory throttle and plugged it back up. And for some reason, it works again. So we're definitely sticking with the stock throttle since we've had better luck with this versus the aftermarket one. Well, I just disassembled the throttle, repositioned the wiring, and retensioned the spring, reinstalled it and clamped everything in place. And now it is working correctly. So I guess I'm just gonna put the bike back together and we are taking this thing out for its first test drive. And just like that, we got a Surron Light Bee X added to the collection. Alright guys, if you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor and hit that like button. If you like this kind of content, want to keep up with my Surron or any of my other projects, consider subscribing to this channel. But this is going to be it for today. Thank you for watching.